Welcome to an extra slice of the pie. I'm Ben Krause. In this show, we're talking about the most pressing matters of the day and connecting them back to the stock of knowledge in economics. My guest today is Nobel laureate James Robinson, co-author of several books, including Why Nations Fail. James is the university professor here with appointments both in the Harris School of Public Policy as well as in the Political Science Department in the Division of Social Sciences. We scheduled our conversation before the big news came out about his Nobel win this year and the conclusion of the recent US elections. And in between, James participated in a public forum here on campus on culture and markets, the potent mix that fueled growth from the Industrial Revolution to the present, which we both reference, so I'll link to that below. But this confluence, for me, is quite remarkable. As James shared the Nobel this year with his longtime co-authors Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson for studies of how institutions are formed and affect prosperity. For example, in their 2019 book, The Narrow Corridor, James and Daron run with Hobbes's metaphor of the state as a leviathan that can be despotic if too powerful, absent if too weak, and shackled for the benefit of prosperity only if a proper and exacting balance of power can be made and maintained between society and the state. Let's dig in with Nobel laureate James Robinson. Before I really start getting into the research, I want to ask you to share something that you shared with me earlier this week, which was, or just describe a screenshot that your wife insisted that you take and that you then share with me. Describe to our audience here what that was.
It was on my phone, it was the number from Sweden calling with all the failed attempts, starting at 4:03 in the morning, and then they called at 4:03 and 4:04 and 4:05 or 4:08 and 4:11. They're very persistent, these Swedes. But I was fast asleep with my phone switched off, of course, so I didn't get any of it. Yeah,
and it continued like that until about what time did they finally get to you?
They didn't, actually. I think they gave up at some point. I mean, I finally talked to the person who was trying to call me at 4 a.m. at about 10 in the morning, actually.
Oh,
it was
wow.
a lot later. Then he sent me an email saying, "Hello, I've been trying to contact you from Sweden. Could you give me a call on this number?" But by the time my wife woke me up and I sort of got in the shower and had some coffee, there were all these media people from Chicago and in our house at 6:15 in the morning. So I was just dealing with they're fabulous, actually. They did a fabulous job, I think. Really liked what they did.
I really liked the video.
Yeah, they did a great job. Yeah. So I'm not, but then I was just super busy with that and everything, and I just wasn't looking at the email and things. And plus I got about 1,000 emails, by 7 a.m. So then that's very hard to manage, 1,000 emails. And so this chap's email, just finally I located it, and then I called him in Sweden, I think about 10 o'clock, something like that, yes.
So, I mean, what I take away from this for all of us economists out there is that you have at least until 10 a.m. to get back to them on the day they try to call you before they give it to somebody else.
Well, they don't actually give you an option of saying, they don't ask you, would you like to receive the Nobel?
Oh, interesting.
They just say, you have been, I don't know if you get to turn it down, but
it's in your mailbox.
I'd be, I don't know if people have turned the Nobel Prize. In England, people turn down honors and things
absolutely.
like that regularly. Yeah.
I recall Bob Dylan not showing up for it, but I don't know if he didn't take it in the end.
That could be right, but I don't think that's going to happen. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's good. That's good. And I'd like to ask you a second question, sort of rolling off of this, which is you were telling me that you've been working to prepare your son for the upcoming trip to Sweden and giving him some insights into sort of comparative national systems. And he seemed to correctly learn from your research that, well, if I extrapolate out, maybe I should infer something about the technological frontier of Sweden.
Yes, he's 9 years old, so I was telling him, okay, Adrian, he's called Adrian, we're going to Sweden and you're going to meet the king and queen of Sweden. And he said, the king of queen of Sweden? It's a bit oldie-timey, isn't it? Like, do they have Wi-Fi in Sweden? Aren't they modern? So he was very upset. The thought of for a 9-year-old, the idea of like being somewhere backward with no Wi-Fi, that's sort of shocking. So, yeah, that was funny.
Does he have
and he said, we don't have a king and queen in America. I said, well, not yet, we don't. Yeah.
Well, there you go. Does he have a particularly favorite show or game, or what is the thing that he would miss most if there wasn't Wi-Fi in Sweden?
He's very into Kung Fu Panda at the moment.
Yeah.
He likes watching. We went to see The Wild Robot twice.
Oh wow!
Which is he's really excited about robots and wild robots
in particular.
Yeah. So he goes through phases.
Yeah.
And he loves this British series called Horrid Henry, which is about a horrid boy called Henry. Extremely funny. Very, very, very uncool, useless parents.
Okay.
So different things. So he doesn't really play video games and
Okay.
things like that. It's more watching movies and things like that. Yeah.
Excellent. So I understand that in some ways your father prepared you, or at least his career helped prepare you for the career that you're now having by being an itinerant engineer, I think is how you
Yeah.
described him.
Yeah.
Could you tell us where that ended up taking you and what age were you at those times?
Well, yeah, I mean, he studied at Imperial College in London, and then he got a job in the Colonial Service. This is in the late 1930s. And then he worked basically overseas, in Africa until he got married, in 1957. And then I was born in 1960, and we sort of instantly moved to Barbados. I think he could never really adjust to life, in Britain, sitting behind a desk. And so actually, even when we moved back to England, because my mother was a teacher, she wanted to restart her career, then he instantly moved back to, he instantly moved back to Africa. And then he ended up working in Saudi Arabia right at the end of his life. So I think, we lived all over the place. And so, yeah, I think that created some sort of curiosity in my mind about the world. I grew up in a house, in England, full of African art and maps of Africa and books about Africa. So it sort of creates this curiosity about the world. Yeah.
And I understand you started asking questions or noticing differences in power dynamics, even at a relatively young age.
Well, I don't want to sort of,
not necessarily in a savant sort of way, but like being exposed
way.
to the juxtaposition of what you were seeing when back home.
Exactly. You're used to, exactly. You know that there's something else going on other than in, well-functioning in England, and maybe that created some. It's not clear how conscious it was, but it's funny in life, what you realize when you get older is like there's many things that sort of you sort of internalize, but you don't really realize it at the time. Like I was talking on Monday about the impact of my thesis advisor.
Yeah.
If you talk to me when I was a PhD student about what was the impact of like Truman Bewley, on me, it would be like, well, he taught me like de Breuil's theory of value and Andrea Mas-Colell's general equilibrium theory from a differentiable point of view, and like all this math and all these sort of techniques and stuff like that. But actually, none of that, that's sort of useful in some way. But the thing that he really transmitted to me was like, he was so critical about everything, like I'm very critical of things, and nothing is ever right. You always we used to go to seminars together and we'd like walk out of a seminar together and I'd be saying, that was like a sort of interesting result. Now, didn't you like proposition 2? And he'd always say his like modal response would be, I'd have found it more interesting if the opposite was true. And I actually found that's kind of an heuristic. So I realize now, whenever I go to a seminar and like somebody's talking about something, the first thing I think of is like, maybe the opposite is actually true, and it's become like for me a heuristic to sort of kind of destabilize, knowledge or my understanding of something. I actually teach that to the graduate students now as something like, it's a little too much, because maybe, he wrote very few papers, I think, because he was so self-critical, and that's not good, that's not good. And it's not a model to, somehow he got away with it, I always used to say like, he wouldn't produce a paper, and then like most people would say, oh, like that guy's like finished, whatever, he doesn't have any ideas or something. But with Truman, they'd say, oh, Truman is working on something so hard, even he can't solve it, And I used to think, how do you get that going for you, like, but I've never figured it out actually, but actually I like writing, I like writing it. Writing is a very for me, it's a very creative process. You start writing something, things come out that you hadn't understood or didn't even know you knew.
And if I understand, he was the first person you ended up texting once you got the news.
I'm still very close to him.
Yeah.
I mean, he's in his 80s, but he's as sharp as ever. So I still, and he's very funny and we're very close personally. So I would love it if he could come to Stockholm actually, because it would be great to celebrate in person with him and his wife also. I'm very close to. Yeah.
Well, so you're finishing up your PhD. My understanding is you're on the job market, and I think it was, what was it?
Yes.
You're March of 1992, going back to your alma mater, London School of Economics.
Zero job offers.
Zero job offers at this
in
point.
The United States. Zero job offers.
Okay.
People don't believe
and
you can be very unsuccessful. I was very unsuccessful. Everyone thought I think I was too flaky. I was kind of all over the place. I was interested in too many things. Then they just think, oh, you're never going to achieve anything.
And how was that feeling in the moment?
It was, it was disorienting. I was lucky that I had sort of very close friends. I was actually a roommate at the time with Stephen Morris, who's now a very distinguished game theorist at MIT, and also Canis Prendergast, who's a professor at Booth here. Yep. He'd actually left. He was doing a postdoc at Oxford. So I had some very good friends who kind of helped me a lot, sort of believe in myself and kind of like hang on in there, So that was good. And then, so 1992, I didn't have a job. I went to LSE, to give an unsuccessful job talk, as it turns out. And so I was talking about theory, game theory, and there was this chap sitting in the front row, kind of interrupting me every 5 seconds.
Like the worst kind of heckler.
Terrible, yeah. So then the other thing which was really funny about was there was this chap right at the back. I didn't say this on Monday, but there was this chap right at the back who looked vaguely familiar, who kept on putting his hand up and saying, "What could you possibly mean by that?" And I thought, oh, this is some chap who's just come in for the free sherry or something, And it turned out to be Ken Binmore, the very famous game theorist. And if I'd known that, I would have completely crumpled, And it was only afterwards he comes up to me and says, "Ken Binmore, very stimulating talk."
So sometimes ignorance can be helpful in those moments.
Yeah, so absolutely. Yeah, I would have died if I'd realized that was Ken Binmore. So then. So this chap was sitting in the front row, like, this guy's so annoying. Like, why doesn't he shut up? So then, and then of course the seminar ends, and then we go off to dinner. And then Kevin Roberts, who was chair of the search committee, starts introducing me to people and says, "Oh, this is Daron Acemoglu. He's a PhD student. He's going to come for dinner too." So we walk out the seminar. We get to the door of the St. Clement's room. We're walking to Covent Garden, and he looks at me. And I'm still like, oh my gosh, I have to go to dinner with this guy? Like, seriously? I mean, and then he looks at me and says, "Have you read this paper by Norton Weingast?" Which I had, as it turned out. And then we start talking about Norton Weingast, going into walking to Covent Garden. And then we sat next to each other. And I guess we just like hit it off. And we just realized we had all these interests in common. And that's, I didn't get the job, but that. And email didn't exist in those days. But, I finally got a job in Australia at the University of Melbourne. And then I remember I got to Melbourne in September of that year. And then somebody explained to me about email. Can you imagine not having email? So he explained to me about email. So I thought, I'll send this Acemoglu guy an email, So I think we'd exchanged letters. Can you imagine people did that?
Maybe I recall doing that, yes.
Carrier pigeon.
Like the letters with the red trim and
So then... And then I got there and I sent him an email, and I probably got, knowing Daron, I probably got an instant reply. On Monday, he starts replying
pre-drafted
to all these emails. We get thousands of emails. He starts replying. I sent him a message saying, "Stop replying to the emails." You just
making us all look bad, dude. Enjoy the moment.
Exactly. That's exactly what I said. You're making me and Simon look bad.
So when does Simon join the band?
So a couple of years later, that we started talking, and then I came back to the US. I visited the University of Pennsylvania thanks to Stephen Morris. So Stephen was teaching at UPenn then, and Stephen got me this visiting gig, and then I went back on the job market, like zero, like basically. by the skin of my teeth, I got this fly out, one fly out to University of Southern California in like March, when you think the job market's over and you're like unemployed, you're going back to Australia, they fly me out, they offered me a job. Okay, great. So then I'm in the US at this time. Daron had got hired by MIT at this point. And then in the fall of that year, which was 1995, we met at this we met one time before that, when I was in Australia, actually, which was I came to England to this Royal Economic Society conference at York. And he was still in England. He was a lecturer at the LSE. And we walked around York on the city walls and stuff, talking about ideas and things like that. So we had connected. And then as soon as I came, we started getting together and started talking about ideas. And I guess the first thing we wrote was in 1996. We started basically writing models and thinking about stuff. And then at some point, we wrote on his blackboard at MIT, all our kind of ideas, and there was a list. I think there was like 10 or 11 or something like our ideas for projects and stuff on the blackboard. And we tried to decide what's the most interesting idea? Yeah. And the most interesting idea we thought was this thing that turned into the Why Did the West Extend the Franchise, which was this early theoretical work we did on democratization. Yeah. And so I started reading about, I was like, okay, democratization, like there's nothing on this in political economy, but political scientists must have studied this. So then I talked to my friend Steve Coates, who's sort of a political economist, who's now at Cornell. Like, what should I read? So he told me, okay, go read the American Political Science Review. So I went to the library, I pulled like 10 years of it off the shelf. I just sat there going through it.
There wasn't search bars at that point?
No. It's issue, couldn't find anything. Steve, there's nothing. Okay, American Journal of Political Science. I went back to the library. I pulled all the American Journal of Political Science off the shelf, start going through it kind of issue by issue by issue by nothing. And then I was at a conference. One of the things I found in the American Political Science Review was a paper by someone called Michael Wallerstein, which had this kind of differential game model of capitalism. So I thought like, oh, okay, here's someone who knows about models. That's what we're looking for. Our idea was, let's take the off-the-shelf model of democratization from the political science literature, naive, and we'll put it in a growth model and whatever. Okay, so then like Michael Wallerstein, this is the guy who wrote that paper with this differential game in it. So I went up to him and said, Professor Wallerstein, let me introduce myself. Yes, and he was a political scientist, wonderful man. I mean, he died tragically young of a brain tumor in his early 50s, but I got very friendly with him. I mean, he was just a fabulous person. And so I describe exactly what we're looking for. And he said, that doesn't exist. And I said, what do you mean it doesn't exist? He said, it's comparative politics. They don't have models in comparative politics. So there's no such model, like it doesn't exist. And then I remember calling up Daron and saying, oh man, this project is way better than we thought it was. Like,
jackpot.
Yeah. So then we started working on those papers. And Daron gave an early version of one of these papers at a seminar at MIT, and Simon had just moved from Duke to MIT. And we had these sort of comparative statics on inequality. And Simon sort of said, we could do empirical work on this. We could get data, and I see exactly how to do it. But in the meantime, we started work on that because it just seemed like, okay, this is really concrete, and we can, this is a great topic. But of course, we were thinking and talking about all these development problems and how to think about development and stuff like that. And then we had this sort of kernel of the idea of like colonial origins, in particular that. Why is there this correlation between latitude and income per capita? That's got to have something to do with the historical process of institution creation. Right. That's got to have something to do with colonialism. And like, I remember one weekend we sat in Daron's office at MIT, like trying to write a model of that. Yeah. And then the Sunday afternoon, or evening, we go to like Au Bon Pain, just near the T station. And then we sat there looking at each other, and then we sort of said, this is an empirical project, like you can't write a model of this. Like this is an empirical project. And neither of us had any idea how to do an empirical project, basically. Like when I was at Yale, the econometrics was just like theorems, essentially. You never went near a computer. So there's all these estimators. You never knew. This is like pre mostly harmless econometrics.
Yep.
So
yeah, I was guessing.
There were 1,000 estimators.
It was a lot harmful.
You didn't know which estimator was the right one. You were always kind of uncertain that you were doing something too simple. It should be more complicated. And anyway, so we were like, ugh. And then Simon came along, and then Simon started saying, let's write something. And Daron called me up and said, there's this British guy in the business school. He's like really fun and interesting, and I think we can work with him, And then we sort of said, okay, but like this democracy, I mean, we finally got round to the stuff on democracy, this income and democracy. So we finally got to the empirical paper that Simon wanted to write to start with. But like, we were really convinced that, okay, great, but this is much more interesting, this other set of ideas. And that's
you started then with colonial origins, right?
Yeah, that was what led to colonial origins and reversal of fortune. And
And like, I mean, just to sort of set the stage on colonial origins of comparative development, insofar as I'm aware, this is the paper that you teach when you're introducing people to causal inference and institutions and development. In fact, I taught it this summer at Harris when I was doing an intro to writing or designing policy relevant research. I think it was name checked explicitly by the Nobel Committee.
Yes.
And I think it's what launched you as what we in like economics call AJR, as sort of the name of this group that the prize is acknowledging. And so many of us have been batting around ideas for the last several decades.
Yeah, I think we were very lucky, because as I said, Daron and I didn't know how to do it. He probably denied that he didn't know how to do an empirical project, but I remember. But what he did know is he had colleagues who did know how to do it. And that's Josh Angrist and Steve Pischke, actually, talking mostly harmless econometrics.
Yeah.
That Josh and Steve, they did know. And
like Daron Pinch hit with Josh
in
at
labor
one
economics.
Point, in labor
and I think
economics,
Steve also.
Okay.
Steve also, yeah. So I think that's... Like, I remember we had a conversation, I think I said this on Monday, where we were collecting this data, and Simon, this idea about the disease environment came from Alfred Crosby's book, Ecological Imperialism, where he talks about the Pilgrim Fathers and how the Pilgrim Fathers were going to go to Guyana. At least this is how I remember it. The Pilgrim Fathers was going to go to Guyana, and then they decided to go to Plymouth because everyone died of tropical diseases in Guyana. And then Simon knew, we're like, okay, great, but how do we operationalize that? But Simon knew about all this work by Philip Curtin, So I think like that's one thing. Like, it's always fun working with those guys because everyone brings surprising things to the table, and we're all, we're spread very thin, but it turns out, if you stick at it long enough,
right,
being spread thin has its advantages.
I mean, just to so everybody knows what we're talking about here, right? You end up using the mortality of European colonists as an instrument for the formation of institutions that they set up. And, I've heard you talk about how the best way to approach research as a social scientist is to do exactly what you're talking about. Identify the most interesting question you possibly can, and then find the best possible methodology you can to answer that question.
Yeah.
And so you're starting to peel back. So Simon's been reading this work. He's learning about this correlation, and how do you take it then to, being able to identify the causal impact, not just present another correlation of these relationships, but really demonstrate that institutions were shaped in a significant way that then led to these economic outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. That's the way I've always tried to do social science. I'm very driven by questions. Like all this work that I've done in Africa in the last 25 years, it's always driven by a question, getting a question, and then you just plunge in. You just throw yourself in. There's a very high return to just going for it, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have to tell you that. So I think that's but it's all about the question. Yeah, I think the methods are great, but I think this sort of obsession with methods is a bit overdone. So I think in that case, we were very fortunate because we were sort of in the right place at the right time, meaning, there was a lot of work on sort of comparative economic growth. But everyone could see it was somehow very problematic. People were looking, at the time they were called Barrow Barrow growth regressions,
Yeah.
which is a sort of, you get the rate of economic growth and you sort of run a regression and you sort of put everything you can think of on the right-hand side and see what's, look at the T statistics, see what's significant, what's not significant. And so I think everyone could sort of say, well, there's all these things kind of moving together. How on earth do I know what's causing what, or what's the real role? They're all correlated. And so I think there was that sort of perception that this is kind of very muddy, this evidence, and we don't know, and for us there were many ludicrous things about that exercise. One was just even why anyone cared so much about the growth rate. Like if you're thinking about these big differences in the world, if you're thinking about, Haiti is a beautiful example actually, because I don't know if I told this story on Monday, but we were at the NBER once, and somebody, I think it was Bill Easterly, I may be wrong about that, but Bill Easterly was talking about, Bill is a fun chap, but I don't want to, but somebody was talking about, Haiti and like economic growth in Haiti, and they had the Heston Summers data set and, or whatever. And we sort of went out into the coffee hour. We said, like, how on earth can you understand anything about Haiti by looking at the growth rate between 1970 and 1990 or whatever it was? Like Haiti is how it is because of this long kind of historical process, the slavery, the whatever, and it's the level that's really interesting, not what the growth rate was in the last 10 years of Baby Doc's dictatorship or something. So I think even that, just refocusing on the level, people used to complain about that. People would say, like, but why aren't you looking at the growth rate? And I'd have to explain again, well, because it's the level. That's the interesting thing. Of course, afterwards, you sort of think like, duh, okay, fine.
This actually harkens back, though, so we had this event earlier this week where we were trying to unpack this very question of, the last 200 years of growth. How did this happen? And more importantly, for me at least, why do we see such dramatic disparities around the world? And I was frankly shocked. It was 4 hours or so, and the slave trade didn't come up at all. The colonization didn't come up at all. And I think credit to one of our research professionals here, Kyle Governor, I think it was.
I know him. He's sitting in my class at the moment.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, a few times. Yes.
Credit to him for speaking up after the event was closed to raise the topic. And you really didn't get an opportunity to answer. So would you care to take this opportunity to share a little bit about your thoughts?
Well, there's a kind of complete consensus in economic history for some reason that's a little baffling, that that the fact that the slave trade, the fact that Britain dominated the slave trade for the entire 18th century has nothing to do with the fact that the Industrial Revolution took place in Britain in the 18th century. Like as I said, I managed to say right at the end that, John Mokyr started with this statement that the Enlightenment took place in the 18th century and the Industrial Revolution took place in the 18th century. And that can't be a coincidence, but you could have replaced the Enlightenment with the slave trade, the ramping up of the Atlantic slave trade. And you could have said that can't be a coincidence. So if that can't be a coincidence counts as a kind of causal argument, then the slave trade definitely has the same weight as the Enlightenment. So I think in the 1970s, economic historians sort of reacted against this so-called Williams thesis, that Eric Williams wrote this book, 1948, Capitalism and Slavery, arguing that slavery, the capital accumulation in the slave trade, generated the Industrial Revolution. And economic historians did these kind of back-of-the-envelope calculations about the profits in the slave trade and the saving rate, and and decided that this couldn't explain the Industrial Revolution. There's never been a serious kind of empirical test on that. There's very little discussion of mechanisms. There could be all sorts of mechanisms, and I actually encourage students all the time to work on that project. I think if you look at history, within history, it's completely different. Like this literature on the history of capitalism, everyone is talking about that. But within economic history, there's this sort of, so I think that's waiting to be blown open, that topic, if you ask me, which is why I'm always encouraging people to work on it. And there's different ways you could work on it, but I do it is about mechanisms, So I mean, and we actually did some empirical work on that, meaning, the first papers we wrote were looking at the impact of colonialism and how it shaped institutions and paths of development in the colonial world. But then we subsequently actually looked at, what we call the rise of Europe, and we showed in fact, that the institutional dynamics in early modern Europe, were tied to Atlantic expansion. And, so that's actually direct evidence which is contrary to the claim that the slave trade had. I mean, we're not looking specifically at the slave trade, but that's all part of it,
Certainly, yeah.
Yes.
Very much part of it. And that actually leads into, up until at least this last week or so, what I would guess most non-academics know you most for, and probably many of the academics as well, which is being one of the co-authors with Daron of Why Nations Fail, where you build out, you further expand on this idea that it's really about these institutions, whether they're extractive, showing up and trying to suck everything out that's possible, or if the conditions are right for the elites to set up base, make a home, bring the family, and still take a whole lot back, but make investments in the long term. And you bring in research and literature and knowledge and all kinds of different, wisdom and information into writing what becomes a very accessible book for, a broad audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I was saying, we always read all sorts of things, we will always just read it, but when you write, I remember my favorite example of this is we have this paper called The Persistence of Power, Elites and Institutions, which is published in the American Economic Review in 2008. And that paper had this enormous sort of discussion of history and whatever, and everything was just like deleted by the editor, and it ends up in this extremely austere, like really complicated kind of dynamic programming problem. There's some nice results in that paper, but like it's so frustrating that no one cares about all this sort of evidence. So one of the things that inspired us to write the book was, we sort of said to each other, look, if we found these examples, so motivating and stimulating, maybe somebody else will. So perhaps we should write them up and just get them out there. And Daron gave these Robbins lectures at the LSE, and we actually, the three of us, started writing a book. But it was very nerdy. It was too cut and paste. It was, and then we sort of said, people have read the papers. We don't want to just regurgitate the papers in a book form. Let's write something more fun. At that point, Simon became the chief economist at the IMF, and he was writing this, 13 bankers. And he was doing like different things. So Daron and I, we kind of piled into it basically, and just had a go at it. I mean, I don't quite know how we did it, honestly, because I think we found this language that we didn't quite have right in Colonial Origins, this inclusive institutions, which I think is exactly the right word, and I think these examples somehow really stick in people's minds, the Nogales, the North and South Korea, Bill Gates and Carlos Slim, sort of, so we and then we just wrote up a lot. I mean, we wrote the book very fast, actually, because we kind of knew that stuff already. We had all the examples. We've been accumulating them for years. And, the narrow corridor took much more work because we had to learn about things we didn't know very much about, and then you could see, like in Why Nations Fail, stuff that we don't, like everyone complains about, where's India? You don't talk about India, or, there's a very superficial discussion of China. Sure, we didn't know that much about China. We just kind of applied the theory and said, this is what the theory implies about China, and that turned out to be quite a provocative argument, by the way. So I think. So that's why, and I also think, I remember Daron saying that, we shouldn't waste too much time doing this, because this type of book completely fails typically. And that's not, it's just really detracting from the papers and,
and that's
Josh,
not quite what happened.
No, it turned out to be massively synergetic, actually, with the more academic papers in a way that we'd never anticipated. Absolutely, quite the contrary. Yeah.
And so you mentioned coming up with the language, talking especially about inclusive and extractive institutions. I remember, so I studied under Frank Fukuyama. One of the things he complained about was you're ditching all of this language that's been developed in political science, neo-clientelism, neo-patrimonialism, and I can understand, some frustration in that space, but the particular language that you chose really resonated in a way that when I would go into meetings with government officials, when I talk about when I talk about something being inclusive or extractive, as opposed to, well, let me explain to you what a client is, what clientelism might look like, what neo-clientelism might look like. We did not get very far ever. But I have heard that you've said that the title of the book itself was off, that it should have had a different title or could have had a different title. And what would you have rather it been called?
I don't know. I should look for that list. I should look for the list on my computer. It must be there somewhere. I've actually forgotten. We had a list of about 10 titles, and we just couldn't. I don't even remember. There must have been a working title I've now forgotten.
Do you remember what you don't like about Why Nations Fail? Like the title itself?
I don't, I gave a lecture at the International Monetary Fund, 10 years after Why Nations Fail came out. And then I had lunch with all these people, and there was a Ethiopian gentleman there, who's very high up in the IMF. And he sort of said, I never read that book because nations failing, people look down there, and he sort of took away this very pejorative connotation. So he didn't read it because he's like, I'm not interested in hearing some white person talk about why Ethiopia is a failure, kind of thing. So that sort of, and I had to explain to him what was, but that was sort of the reaction that I was a bit concerned about, failure. It's a sort of, that's not, and I think you could see from my talk on Tuesday, that's actually not how I think about these things, at all. Yeah. But the editors, we had this fabulous editor, John Mahaney, actually, and so he just picked that. He said, "That's the title. That's." And once one of these editors gets that into their head,
they're running.
Exactly. You're finished. You can't. They won't negotiate. They really care about the cover and the title. And I think it probably was a good title in retrospect. It sticks in people's mind. It gets them to take it off the shelf. But what I was uncomfortable about is exactly, that's
I think justifiably so. But it didn't really come up with solutions or really a story of where these institutions were coming from oftentimes. And so you end up writing a sequel of sorts here with The Narrow Corridor.
Kind of. The purpose of the narrow corridor, there were several reasons for writing the narrow corridor. One is, I think it kind of communicates much more this idea that this is a sort of process. This is not something you don't pull a switch and you move.
Just walk through the door.
That's not how it happens. So we like that. And we got more into this kind of historical emergence of inclusive institutions. But what I like, most about it, I think, which should be evident actually from Tuesday, but is like when we talk about extractive and inclusive institutions, it's sort of, we put all of this stuff in this bin of extractive institutions. At the start, we talk about Somalia, and you can fail, you can be extractive in different dimensions. You can have absence of sort of an effective state, or you can have absence of kind of accountability, or, so there are these two dimensions. And if you fail in either dimension, you're extractive. But obviously it's kind of ludicrous in the sense that, the problems in Somalia are completely different from the problems in China. And I think what the narrow corridor managed to do was kind of unpack those cases in what we thought was a really nice way to say, look, this gives you a very simple way of seeing that in lots of the world, the problem is completely different. There is a powerful state in China, but it dominates society. In Somalia, it's almost the other way around. The society dominates the state, and that creates very different dynamics and very different challenges. And and I think those distinctions are extremely important. So I think so that's what I really like about the framework. And obviously, it was an opportunity for us to sort of think through many of these other cases that we knew much less about: China, India, but it's also, the problem is, because we had to do all this research for it and reading, and we spent much longer writing it than Why Nations Fail, it's much more dense and academic, and therefore it's much less accessible. So
there's certainly a trade-off there.
Absolutely. I mean, what I find is academics tend to like the narrow corridor much better than Why Nations Fail.
I could see that.
But with non-academics, it's the other way around.
I mean, in some ways, the writing of the book itself is like a metaphor for the story of the book, right? You have the state and you have society, and if you have too much state, you're losing liberty because you're being pulled into totalitarianism. If society is too strong and there's not enough state, you're losing liberty to the cage of norms, and you need to sort of maintain this dynamic equilibrium between the two of them, and it's a long process, like you're saying. And similar when you're writing a book, you can be trading off between a broad audience and all of the research, and the getting absolutely the most precise statement right on every single finding. And you have to figure out how you're going to navigate that to sort of maximize the reach over time.
Yeah, exactly. But the book was also very important, I think, for Daron and I in our thinking, actually, which will become more evident in our next book. But
is this an exclusive? Is that what we call this? I'm new to
no,
this.
I've already
I don't know how
given
this
talks
works.
about it. Actually, I gave a talk about it at Northwestern last year. Which everyone hated, actually.
I started this morning with you. Really hurt that I heard you on Marketplace to start my day off, thinking that you were just talking to me right now, but apparently not.
But just to give you one example, again, which I talked about on Tuesday, which is we're too materialistic, in our approach, I think, and that's true of economics. It's true of Marxism. It's true of like a lot of contemporary social theory. But once you get into the Chinese case and you look at the Chinese case, and you think about what's distinct about China and the sort of persistence of this equilibrium, then it's got to have something to do with ideas. It's got to have something to do with this whole kind of culture of Confucianism and legalism, that the Chinese created this sort of intellectual framework within which the power dynamics fit. And it's sort of impossible. We managed to talk about it as if that wasn't true, but obviously it is true.
I was actually interested in asking you about that, because I seem to recall you talking about how China couldn't keep this going in earlier work, that this was going to be sort of a short-lived expansion. But in the paper that you presented this week, you were talking about the China puzzle and really raising the question of, how do we understand, our models are inadequate if we can't account for what's been happening in China.
I think there's different questions there. I think one question is, can they keep the economics going?
Okay.
And that I'm skeptical about. Can they keep the political system going? That seems much more likely that they can, even if economy sort of economic growth peters out. But I think, even the growth. What I was talking about is the growth. Do we really have the right explanation for that? We sort of look at it. I'm sort of struck by how much social theory is kind of generalization based on Western history, basically. My favorite example is Marxism, of course, not neoclassical. I think the same is true about neoclassical economics, but Marxism is clearly a sort of, Marx looked out of his window, or in London, the window of the British Museum, and he kind of made a generalization about there's proletariat, there's the bourgeoisie, there's kind of class struggle, there's whatever, and but that turns out not to be a terribly useful theory for thinking about Africa. So.
And you use the analogy of Adam Smith, but in Tivland, looking out his window, and what is he going to see that's different than Scotland in 1776?
Exactly, but isn't that so obvious? I mean, it's so obvious, So I think that's something you're probably going to hear me talk about quite a bit in the next few years. That I this issue of how parochial a lot of social theory is. I think economics is just sort of fantastic in terms of the methodology and tools that it sort of provides for thinking about the world. But I think the types of questions that we think about and the types of explanations that we can conceive of is very restricted by our own history and by the way we've sort of thought about things. And I guess, working in, the global south, I don't really like this expression, the global south, but it allows me to avoid talking about underdevelopment, because I think that's also a complete misconception, it's just we haven't conceptualized properly the differences between these societies, and we've seen them, and I think that's partly because of this kind of this development of social theory as a sort of the glorification of the West. We've sort of seen them as a failed version of ourselves. What I was saying on Tuesday is we should just stop thinking about the world like that. It doesn't help us understand them. It doesn't help us help them. And it's very disempowering for them. That's what I've noticed. I taught in Bogota, for 28 years every summer, this summer school in Colombia. and I'd get the students to read this famous essay by José Martí, this Cuban intellectual called Nuestra America.
Yeah, I know it well.
Yeah, exactly. And then I'd sort of start making fun of them, saying like, okay, Colombia, let's write up the characteristics of a kind of successful society here, like the United States, for example. And then now let's compare that to what, Colombia looks like. Basically, Colombia is a failed version of the United States, just like trying to provoke them to say, like, there's something like really wrong about that,
Yeah.
So how do we tackle that? But, I think that's
I mean, I know some people who have done this research on like the path dependence of institutions and how once you're in a certain kind of institution, like say neoclassical economics, that carries forward for sometimes centuries. I don't know if you're familiar with this work.
By
I believe it's AJR. So, I'm not sure their actual names. I just know them by the acronym.
Yeah.
There seem to be some lessons that one could draw from your work. That we could use some self-reflection on.
Yeah, and I think there have been these sort of efflorescences of kind of intellectual sort of, like think about dependency theory. Like dependency theory was sort of like the periphery pushing back. But they latched onto something completely silly, like, blaming, let's blame everybody for all our problems and let's blame. No, that's just so disempowering,
right.
So that's not what you want to be. Of course, it's true that United Fruit Company messed up Guatemala in the 1950s. Okay, fine, but people have agency, and that's, there's so many examples in the world today of countries like getting their act together, and nobody stopped them, and so I think that was very exciting kind of intellectually, but it led to a dead end. I can imagine in the 60s it was super exciting,
right.
but it led to a dead end, and what we need is, something. Yeah, that's anyway. Yes, but you're right.
I want to ask you about this. So this most recent work that you've been doing, you gave the example of Botswana, and Botswana following a different path. It's perhaps optimizing differently than we would, at least in the United States. And the question that I had when you were presenting the example, so maybe you could share a little bit about it, about the thinking there. But the question I want you to come around to is, it looked a lot like the cage of norms that you talk about in the narrow corridor. And so I'm interested in hearing from you how it's not, or what am I missing there?
Yeah, no, very good. Yes, you made exactly the right connection. I mean, and that's one of the reasons why I like that. It's a reinterpretation of the cage of norms in some sense. What I was saying is, I think like those societies, that I was talking about, like Botswana, because Botswana was not a developed country, and whatever. And it maybe was organized in a way that was not propitious for inventing, capital accumulation and technical change and innovation. But it was a legitimate order, And if you get the space to reorganize yourself and you reorganize your society, you can do it, you can do it. And so and I would think that's exactly what happened in Botswana. So I think it's exactly a kind of reinterpretation of what we called the cage of norms in the narrow corridor. So I think you made exactly the right sort of connection, and there's a big difference between that and Russia,
right.
For example.
There's a big difference. Yeah, absolutely.
And
so just to could you summarize what is the cage of norms and how is it related to this Botswana story, and where do you think it can go from where you've left it?
Yeah, so in the framework of the narrow corridor, we sort of say there's these sort of three equilibria, and there's these two kind of extreme ones. One where the state dominates society, think about China, or Russia at the moment. And then one where society dominates the state, okay? So you could sort of say that's going to be a situation with kind of a big dearth of all sorts of public goods, without state institutions. And so what we argue there, this cage of norms, is, well, society kind of proliferates all these norms in order to sort of stabilize the situation in some sense. But I think, we give these examples from the TIV, incidentally. In that book, we kind of, we're sort of interpreting these as things that kind of impede development, and I think that's right. I was now I was talking about trade-offs. I think people traded off stabilizing their values, stabilizing their political system, their social system it's not clear that they were so conscious about this trade-off.
And I think also the question is who has the agency to do the trade-off?
Yeah, well, we don't know that much about that. We know there are some well understood cases, like I did all this research with Nathan Nunn and Sarah Lowe's and John Weigel about the Kuba Kingdom in, Congo. And one of the things that drew us to work on the Kuba Kingdom is we actually know a lot about, because of the oral history and the way that was written down early in the last century and then kind of synthesized by Jan van Sina. We know a lot about actually agency in the creation of institutions in the 17th century. And, in the case of the TIV, we don't know about that. We don't know, did these practices kind of evolve? Did somebody actually create them? We don't know that we can just look at them and sort of interpret them in a particular way, and that's problematic, for all the obvious reasons. We know much less about what actually happened. So I think like what I'm trying to say now about those places, and this is really, I've been trying to study for the last a long time, these cases of I've been doing a lot of work in South Korea, for example, the last 5 years, trying to understand just exactly what happened in the 1970s and how did President Park do things, and like why did things happen, and
how did he go from general to president?
Exactly.
In a legitimate way.
We've been working in Rwanda. I was in Rwanda in the summer, in Somaliland also, which is another fascinating case of place which has sort of got its act together. We were together in Chile, in the September. That's another fascinating instance, actually, of a country that really got itself onto a different trajectory, in the 1990s in this transition from dictatorship. So I think, I'm trying to find a different way of talking about this cage of norms. I think, I think there's trade-offs, but I think what they did in Botswana was they reinvented themselves. They kind of formed these institutions in the 1960s, but what that looked like was not the United States. It did not, like, as I said, political scientists rank Botswana as never having been a democracy. The same political party has been in power the entire time. It's a basically de facto one-party state. You look at that and say it's not a democracy, it's a one-party state, you can't have development. But they did have development, and they had good governance. So where the heck is it? You have to look for it. It's not where you expect it to be. But if you knew something about how traditional Swana society was organized, you actually would know where to look for it. And I was showing a photograph of where it is, on Tuesday. So
specifically in community meetings.
Exactly. No one's voting on anything, but there's enormous deliberation and kind of consultation. And, one of the first times I went to...
One of my questions, though, about that is like, I don't know what the equivalent is in that setting. I've never been in Botswana, but, say I'm gay or like a woman or an elder or a youth in that meeting, whatever the kind of person is that doesn't have voice, because I'm assuming there has to be someone on the margin there.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think, if you look at, the earliest descriptions of the functioning of the Hutla, which would be, late 19th century, it's all men, adult men. Basically, there might be women, but they're sort of on the fringe. If there's an issue that specifically concerns women, then women get invited, but mostly it's adult men, sure. Now it's, that photograph I showed you, now it's much more diverse. It's all adults. But of course, there are these issues, in Africa that, gay people, for example, there are issues, this is, homosexuality is a very sensitive issue in sub-Saharan Africa. People have very different ideas about that than we do in our country. Most people do. I don't quite know how to think about that. I try very much to sort of respect other people's normative framework, and I try very hard to sort of see the problems from their perspective and not my perspective, for all the reasons we've been discussing. But obviously there's an issue about, like, we have values that we sort of think are universal, but they have different values. And what do you do? I worked for years in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone, female genital mutilation is extremely common, still kind of culturally accepted, practiced by the female secret society. How do you think about that? I find that very difficult it seems that seems to jar terribly with what I think of as my system of values. But I think you have to understand the Sierra Leoneans don't think about it like that. And maybe that will change, think about, discrimination against women, in this country or gay people, Alan Turing, for heaven's sake, one of the greatest geniuses of the last century, was basically forced to commit suicide, because he was gay. The man who won the Second World War played a very large part in winning the Second World War for the Allies. So you think about that. It's not so recently that homosexuality, I think, was illegal in England until 1968, was it?
Yeah. I am certainly not, to be clear, I'm not claiming that we should be, you or I, have any place to be coming in and saying this is right or this is wrong.
No.
I just found, when I read The Narrow Corridor, especially the concept of the cage of norms and this dynamic between society and state was extremely compelling to what I was seeing in my experience in the world. And I found it a very useful tool. It's a model. It's not, it's useful, except for when it's not. And you seem to be exploring where it might not be, which is exciting, I think.
I think, I've just been doing this research with my collaborators in Colombia, for example, on what we call antisocial norms. I think in Colombia you see many pretty perverse social norms. And so I think I
have some of that. I have some work on that in Haiti as well.
Okay. Yeah. So I think it would be being a bit too romantic, to sort of think that all of these things are kind of providing some, socially desirable thing,
right.
and
even assigning antisocial, I sort of wrestle with, how am I defining even the social in this particular case? Because in some ways you have to define an in and an out, even when you're trying to maximize that particular outcome. But I really appreciate that you're struggling with it. I think that's important, and not just assuming that we know. I think that's one of the things I find most refreshing about the work that you bring in, not just now, but throughout your career. One of the things that I also struggle with, though, is I hear you often balk when asked about making recommendations or advising or getting engaged in these spaces. And I completely agree with many of the reasons that you put up, that, oftentimes the assumption is just we know and everyone else is dumb or just needs our superiority in the space. That or even just I lack the time to know the space in its particulars enough to be helpful. Or, I kind of the worst, I shouldn't say worst, but the most common that I hear is I've got a silver bullet. And the truth is, no matter what werewolf you think you're hunting, it's not going to take it down, right? So all of those things, very compelling. But I think about the counterfactual, right? You talk about how the way that these extractive institutions are overcome is by the people on the margins that we've been talking about. Whatever the margin is for that society, rising up and demanding inclusion. And they're going to look for allies. And you are one of the people that I think I would want them to have as an ally in their exploration of that space, more than the other people that feel so confident that they've got the right answer.
I always think, everyone needs help. Think about the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement.
I'm thinking about me trying to get my kids out the door this morning, right? It's everyone needs help.
They help. Like in Edward Banfield's famous 1958 book, The Moral Basis of a Backward Society, pretty awful title.
Oh, wow.
Where he studied underdevelopment in southern Italy in this Chiaramonte. Right at the end of the book, he starts talking about, how could this, he characterizes poverty in Chiaramonte as being a consequence of what he calls amoral familism, which is sort of people are trapped into this very inefficient, non-cooperative equilibrium where, I only trust my immediate family, and I think if I meet you, I think you're going to basically try to put one over on me, so I put one over on you before So
I was just talking about that with my team yesterday about, how do you meet people? I try to exchange away until I figure out, are we related? And that way we won't shoot each other, right? In some meaningful way.
So, and right at the end of that book, he asks, how will Chiaramonte ever change? What will change? And the first thing he says is, well, of course, it has to come from outside, because they're never going to, their whole problem is they can't cooperate. So to change, you have to cooperate and you have to coordinate on a different way of behaving. And there's just no way that's going to happen. It has to come from outside, So I think outsiders do have a positive. One of my friends is a big kind of, activist, like Suresh Naidu. You probably, I don't know.
I do. Yeah.
Suresh always says, he's very involved in studying unionization and under what circumstances, companies unionize or plants unionize. And that always comes from outside. He says, like, plants never sort of spontaneously unionize. Someone has to come from outside and kind of break the collective action problem. So I think, like I think I said on Monday, I think like my Nigerian friends know better what the problem is than Western academics. Their problem is they can't cooperate or organize, or find a common language. And I think, to go back to why nations fail, I think, the strengths of this terminology of inclusive and extractive institutions is that it allows you to kind of talk about a lot of countries and sort of say, look, Colombia, Zimbabwe, North Korea, all the details look different, but here's what they have in common. But once you want to change the equilibrium, then all the details suddenly become important. And that's why I'm very reticent to kind of get into that. But I do think, the ideas are important in the sense that, of, what's politically feasible and what should you do first. And, then you have to know a lot. You have to know a lot about the context. And I don't want to pretend in that way. I always think, look at the mess that all these economists, I don't know what the counterfactual is, but all these economists who rushed over to Russia, in the early 1990s with this kind of simplistic free market advice, where did that leave us? I don't know what the counterfactual is, but it certainly didn't do much good. So I think, like I'm very hesitant about the ethics of doing things like that and about, whether how to really help people and maybe the ideas are important in terms of giving people an interpretation. I always think, I read Jonathan Israel's book about the French Revolution recently. And, his basically, the way he tells that story is, the king is, the state is bankrupt and the king sort of calls the Estat General, for the first time in however many hundreds of years it is. And so people have to get elected to go to Paris, And then he tells a story in Rouen, and I think it's Rouen, Arras maybe, I can't remember now, where Robespierre is, and people are running and they're complaining about this and complaining about that. And, and they, like, everyone is complaining about something different. And, and then the ideas, Rousseau or whatever, give them a way of saying, this is the problem. Yeah. This is the problem and this is the solution. And it kind of brings people together in this sort of coalition. And that's when the revolution really starts gaining momentum. That it's, so that's the way he tells the story. And maybe there's too much emphasis on the ideas, but maybe that's a way that, this inclusive and extractive institutions can help, and
I very much think so. Yeah. And in fact, my sort of career pathway after working in the social sector in many of these places for a decade and a half, I was really searching for not, you mentioned economists causing havoc around the world. I mean, it's not limited to Western economists, right? Westerners in the world in general. I think Joel, during our talk, said like the great infliction of the West on the rest of the world, right? And so the part of the reason I ended up back in academia was searching for a way to use the skills, talents, privileges, passions that I've got in a way that does help without perpetuating what brought us to potentially needing help in the first place. And so it very much resonates with me as we're trying to struggle to figure out what is the way that we can offer a lever, maybe go farther, delve into the particulars, but be an ally. We're not going to be the mover, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
I'm a little remiss because I mentioned your wife at the top end, but I haven't asked about any of the work that the two of you are doing together.
Well, we just put out as a BFI working paper this project on it's called Fear and Dreams, which is like studying variation amongst paramilitary groups in Colombia, which is a project that we started together when I was on sabbatical in Bogota 12 years ago. We did a lot of field work in this area called the Magdalena Medio, in between Bogota and Medellin, and we interviewed these paramilitary commanders in prison, in the court. We went to the court. We realized these people were showing up. These paramilitaries had demobilized, and they were showing up in this court, and you could just attend. So we went there, and they brought these paramilitary groups from La Picota, these commanders from La Picota, which is a big prison.
Yeah.
And they were just like sitting there, so we were sitting here. And then and she was like, I'm like all nervous and stuff. And she's like this. And then it was lunch, they got their sandwiches out, these guys, So they got their sandwiches out. I mean, this is like warlords, basically. They got their and we were like, she said,
everyone's got to eat.
Let's go talk to them. Let's go talk to them. And we were like, oh, seriously? But and then we went, we introduced ourselves, Señor Zuluaga, ¿cómo estás? ¿Cómo está?
Yeah.
And they were like, who the heck are these people, these white people? But then they sort of Google you, and then they kind of realize you have to explain, and then we had this one. Did
one of them have a book to sign? They're like, oh, he's the guy.
They have my books now. Yeah. One of them, he's called Luis Eduardo Zuluaga. He was very, very clever, totally uneducated campesino, left school when he was 13. Very smart, very smart. So they moved him for Christmas to this prison down in the Magdalena Medio. Actually, it's a prison. It's in the farm that Pablo Escobar, the famous drug lord, has, his famous farm. There's a prison in it now. And we went to see him in the prison, and it was great because he was on his own, basically. Like when they're all together, everyone is a little cautious, about talking and what should we say, what should we not say. We got him on his own, and by that time, he'd completely got what we were interested in. Like he really understood exactly what we were interested in. We had this most fantastic conversations about, like, who did this and why did they do it and what motivated them. And when he talked about it, we're trying to explain, like, the very different strategies these paramilitary groups used, like in terms of public good provision. Some of them built schools and roads and hospitals and, and bull rings and there's also an enormous amount of violence, of course. And like what explains the pattern of public goods and violence. And, the way he told it is always like about socialization. They'd always tell some story about that person's family background and that person's values. And, that's the hypothesis that we ended up basically investigating, that there was a real difference between, what in Colombia would be called a campesino and other people. The campesino have different values, they have different social preferences, you could say. So that's a project that, we just published we just put out as a working paper, after all these years, a huge amount of work. And we have a lot of follow-up projects on that.
So the takeaway, when I read the working paper, I was reminded of The Boys. I don't know if that's a TV show you've seen. It's it has a character named Homelander who is, I don't want to spoil it for you, but not a good person. But he has this line that's something like, I'd prefer to be loved, but if I can't be loved, I'm happy to be feared, or something like that. And that's very much the takeaway of this particular paper.
What you see is there's a very strong, positive correlation between public good provision and violence, basically, which is it's not what we expected.
No, not at all.
You sort of think like it's about good guys, like they give.
I mean, very much like you're very much like your thesis advisor, like coming out of a talk and being like, that is exactly the opposite of what I would have expected. That's a project. We could write a book about that, So sounds like you're on your way. So is that the fourth book, or is that?
No, I don't know. But we know a lot. We know a lot, because we've been working on it for so long and we're so immersed, in it. But we've also been working, in Nigeria together the last few years. We've been working with Maria Angelica Bautista, that's my wife's name. We're working a lot in eastern Nigeria, working with colonial sources. Looking at the historical kind of origins of female empowerment in eastern Nigeria, and it's just fascinating, eastern Nigeria. So we have so many ideas and projects. We're just constructing data, and we did a little pilot actually just recently. I really need to kind of allocate some bandwidth to that. So that's that we're working in eastern Nigeria together, and we've done so many things together, like in terms of just field work in Congo and Sierra Leone, and especially in Colombia, many different parts of Colombia.
That's remarkable. I had the fortunate opportunity to join on Monday when we had the press conference here at the university to celebrate your winning, and one of the parts of your remarks really struck me. You mentioned something about or recognized all of those people who supported you, who believed in you, even at times when you probably didn't believe in yourself. And what I've found coming into academia is a community where the pressures and really I would say the mental illness is at a level that I've not seen in any of the rest of my career. Yeah. And I certainly have struggled with way more than I would have liked of my share of that. And Lord knows my therapist gets to hear from me quite a bit, probably more than he'd like. I was wondering if you'd be willing to share one of those moments that you didn't necessarily believe in yourself.
Well, I mean, I remember the second time, having failed to get a job in the United States the first time. The second time I went on the job market, when I got this one offer at USC, I was visiting UPenn, thanks to Stephen Morris. Again, it was like, that was Daron, that we were already talking, and, he just kept me sane. Honestly, we just talk on the telephone every day, and he just was just, that was very important. Stephen also, and Canis, and it was just very important. But I think also when I moved to USC, I met very early on Ken Sokolov, who was an economic historian at UCLA. I got very, very close to Ken. Ken was my kind of intellectual mentor, and he just inspired so much of our work. I think and he was just really, encouraging, but just, I guess what I, just so serious about intellectual life and academic work. And of course he helped me professionally, but it was never about the professional stuff. You need a paycheck, you need a job, whatever. But it's never about that. We never talk about stuff like that. We just talk about ideas. That's what we talk about. Like with Ken, so he pushed me and he believed in me. Danny Roderick also, I think Danny, was one of the first people who sort of thought that I had some kind of merit, and he tried to get me hired at the Kennedy School. Another failed job talk, and Danny's always been absolutely fantastic, kind of supporting me, pushing me, I just feel so guilty at the number of letters of recommendation those guys must have written for me. Ruth Collier, actually, also at Berkeley, who sort of rescued me from USC, that when Daron and I were writing these, Ruth Collier is a very distinguished comparativist in political science. We were writing these these early democracy papers, and I was reading this unpublished manuscript she had about sort of paths to democracy, the book was called. And then I started talking to her on email, and she sort of said, well, what are you working on? And so I sent her these papers, and then she got really, she's a completely qualitative scholar. Yeah. But somehow she realized that she recognized there was something kind of different about this. And then they invited me out of the blue for a job talk, in political science. And, and I'd never given a talk in my life in political science. And it was probably almost a disaster, actually. But somehow, again, they recognized that there was something different here, and I had some kind of... I think, I taught myself all the relevant political science just by reading books out the library, because at this point I was just interested in this and that, and I'd read an enormous number of books by political scientists just because I was just trying to understand, okay, what do political scientists know about this topic, and just without guidance, except Michael Wallerstein, I was mentioning Michael, he helped me a lot, but I didn't know many political scientists at that point. So I think many people pushed me, like that, and helped me. I think Barry Weingast at Stanford, Jeff Frieden, who was my colleague at Harvard for many years, who's now at Columbia, Jeff supported me, pushed me, just got excited about what we were doing. That's young people, I get so sad, that young people have all these conspiracy theories about how you become successful in economics, and you have to know the right people, and you have to network and stuff like that. And, but of course you do have to network, and you have to give talks, and you have to get yourself out there. But my personal experience, we didn't have any powerful kind of godfathers or people backing us or whatever. People just got excited about the ideas, and I think that's just really sort of heartening. I always try to emphasize that to young people, you know, like one thing that is great about economics is like you open up the American Economic Review, you know, or the Journal of Political Economy, any issue, there'll be some paper by some person you've never heard of at some kind of weird university, you know, somewhere or other. And like, he just had a good idea, you know, and that is recognized. And I think that's kind of beautiful, and we should celebrate that.
That is absolutely beautiful. Yes.
Yeah.
And we should be celebrating more. Thank you for sharing that. Before we move into the lightning round, I know you have some work with Soren Hen coming out soon, or in development, about Africa as a success.
Yes.
So
Yes.
can you point us to some of the good news that we should be looking forward to coming from the subcontinent?
Yeah, this started out as, you know, when I've been teaching about Africa for many years, and at some point I threw away all my lecture notes. I'm literally, you know, I threw them away and deleted all the files off my computer and said, okay, I have to start this again, you know. And the reason is there was such a kind of sort of friction between, you know, Africa, there's dictatorship, there's famine, there's poverty, there's, you know, whatever. And then my personal experience of being in Africa, which is just, I love it, you know?
Yeah.
And so like, how is that possible? You know, I like electricity and I like hot water, but like, so I just tried to reorganize everything I did in just a totally different way. And I think Soren, who was a student of mine at Harvard, you know, he came here, he was a postdoc here. And during the pandemic, we sort of said, okay, let's
bubble.
So we wrote a paper called Africa's Latent Assets, which is sort of published in an obscure journal about kind of, what is it about Africa that's sort of positive? You know, like what could I say that's great about Africa that we could learn from about Africa? And I think this is the next sort of stage of that, which is, but, you know, when you talk to people about that, they'll say, yeah, okay, but look at the GDP per capita, blah, blah, blah. And I think, you know, the point about this paper is, is the first section is called Decentering the Great Divergence. You know, I think economic historians have been obsessed with this sort of success of the West and, you know, the failure of the rest and all of that. And great, you know, there's a lot to celebrate, you know, in terms of, you know, increased life expectancy, increased health and living standards.
Orders of magnitude in some circumstances.
Absolutely.
Right?
And there's a lot to celebrate. You know, not much of it has spilled over, you know, into most parts of Africa, by the way, you know. But leaving that aside,
child mortality rates, maternal mortality, it's not where it should be, but it is certainly dramatically transformed.
Yes, that has, absolutely, yeah. But a lot of it hasn't.
That's right.
A lot of the other
and
stuff
certainly nowhere near where we should be.
We take for granted.
That's right.
So the Africa as a success story is really about, okay, you know, let's stop thinking, as we've been discussing, let's stop thinking of Africa as a failed version of, like, you know, they were trying to do what we did and we succeeded and they failed. Maybe Africans were trying to do something different. And I think, like, a lot of my sort of research in the last few years, like little bits, you know, this is a sort of trying to pull it together. And my reading of African history is Africans weren't trying to do that because they weren't trying to do what we were doing in the West, you know. And how do I know that? How could I measure that? Well, you know, Soren and I kind of calculated we're still working on it, you know, but we calculated for the first time a number that I've never seen anyone calculate before, which was like, how many, you know, at the time of the scramble for Africa, how many polities, let's use the word, like politically independent societies were there in Africa? And the answer is like tens of thousands. So the number we have at the moment is 20,000, probably way too low. Okay, so Africa was fragmented into tens of thousands of separate polities. Okay, and our argument is that's exactly what they were trying to achieve. And if you look at the details, you see there's many mechanisms and institutions that were designed to keep the political scale of society small. Okay, that's not a failure, it's a success. Okay, now it's a success that might have made Africa extremely vulnerable to the pernicious effects of European commercial and colonial expansion. But of course, the Africans themselves could never have imagined.
That was not part of their plan.
It wasn't part of their plan, exactly. You know, and one of the things that, you know, we're sort of studying now, there's going to be a little bit. So basically, that paper is just like documenting that fact, showing, you know, kind of showing the numbers. And
this is the one that includes as well the translation. Am I correct? Of
the stranger, guest, and stranger.
Yes.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's you know. So again, that's you see that observed. Like, there's a history book about
what is it exactly? Just because you and I know what we're talking about.
The fact is, that in most African languages, the words for guest and stranger and foreigner are the same, basically.
Yeah. And where else in the world do you see that?
Nowhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nowhere else.
It's incredibly striking.
Yeah. Nowhere else. So why is that? For me, that's because there's this deep history of like migration and mingling, and I think social scientists have this sort of obsession with like ethnicity in Africa, and like Africa is divided into these ethnic kind of groups and stuff. But actually, the truth of the matter is, this is something which at most characterizes the colonial period and post-colonial society, where politics are sort of coalesced around these particular identities. But actually the historical situation is these African societies were extremely cosmopolitan. People were moving around, people were mingling, including in Botswana, by the way. So we talk about Botswana in the article. Like the evidence in Botswana, which actually we have from the 1940s, very detailed information about the kind of social composition of these different parts of Botswana. So, Botswana has this sort of image of Botswana's been successful because it's so homogeneous ethnically. That's actually nonsense. It's total and utter nonsense, actually.
It really caught me off guard when I saw that. Yeah.
Yes. So that, this why is the word guest, stranger, foreigner the same? I think that's a reflection of how open and fluid African societies were. People were valuable. You want people to come. Most, more centralized politically centralized African societies were ruled by outsiders. What our great colleague, now passed away, now late, as they'd say in Nigeria, Marshall Salins, who was a very, very distinguished social anthropologist here, who passed away tragically a couple of years ago. Marshall used to call this like stranger kings. That outside, they were even ruled by outsiders. Now, of course, that's not, in England, the royal family are Germans, basically, so it's not, and the Inca, the Inca emperor was probably a stranger king too. So it's not only in Africa, So
incredible cosmopolitanism, right? Like unprecedented anywhere else in the world.
Absolutely.
So all of these independent polities in the tens of thousands, we're talking about individual, current nation states of Botswana. Let me just ask before we move on, why does it make sense to talk about all of Africa together, or at least all of sub-Saharan Africa together in this way?
Yeah, that's a great point. I talk about it when I teach,
Yeah. And I've seen you acknowledge it. So
absolutely, Africa is not a country, as they say,
Yes.
So I think it makes sense.
A continent with the most countries.
Yeah. I think it makes sense because there are these patterns, like many Africans speak Bantu languages, for example. Yeah. And what you see within these kind of Bantu languages, you do see common cultural elements, in my book, I'm writing a book actually about Africa, funnily enough.
How many books are you teasing here?
I give this example of
I show up with a stack, and you've referenced at least 3 more that I need to be picking up pretty soon here.
I use these different examples to show, I always, that religious ideas, for example, African ideas of God and ancestors and people's relationship to ancestors and deities is very common throughout Bantu Africa. People's theory of health and diseases is actually very common throughout Africa. So I would say, the Bantu people brought, many ideas and technologies and kind of social structures, think about age sets, or initiation.
And for those who don't know, the Bantu people moved across.
Right. So they started out in eastern Nigeria and kind of western Cameroon, and they migrated right throughout central, eastern, and southern Africa over a period of thousands of years, probably starting about 2,500 BC. But even then, you see, you think about the Mande people, many parts of West Africa, you have people speaking in Mande languages, from which originally come from Mali and things like that. They borrow and adapt social institutions. They have things which are unique, like cousinage or something. Yeah. But so I think just that history of, of kind of borrowing and cultural transmission and migration does create some common element that makes it useful to talk about Africa. Once I was at a conference, I think in Chile, many years ago, and I was talking about comparative development and Latin America or whatever, and I talked about Argentina or whatever and Bolivia, and this Argentine guy got extremely annoyed like he said, you're a British guy, right? I mean, do you compare yourself to Albania? Like you're in Europe, right? So he got really annoyed that Argentina was being compared to Bolivia. Yeah. So it's a fair point.
Yeah. It's not out of bounds by any means. Yeah. So finally, are you ready for our lightning round?
Go for it.
Okay. So what book or books are you currently reading right now, or you would recommend?
Ooh, gosh. What books am I reading right now? Well, I'm reading Graeber and Wengrow's book on human history. What's it called? A Theory of Everything.
Yeah.
So this is this enormous reinterpretation of human history. If you're going to read it, get to chapter 10 fast, because it only becomes apparent what the argument is in chapter 10. Most people pick the book up and they stop reading it because it's it goes off in all sorts of directions. But it's absolutely, I found it really exciting and interesting. It's full of ideas. And it's very much in the spirit of my own work, actually, my own thinking, which is sort of trying to challenge these kind of evolutionary narratives of history. And they're sort of activists, especially David Graeber was an activist, So David thought, you could change the world and you could choose how to structure your societies in different ways. And I think that's absolutely right. I'm very good friends with Jared Diamond, and Jared and I edited a book together. We've organized lots of conferences. I think he's just an astonishing scholar.
And for those who don't know Jared Diamond, they almost certainly know his book.
Guns, Germs, and Steel.
That's right.
Yes, fabulous book. But I think the thesis is almost totally wrong. I don't think...
Going back to the first paper we talked about today, it's like one of the first things you're addressing.
Yeah, I don't think, the success of human societies, our theory is all about, it's how humans themselves organize their society that determines whether they're successful economically or not. It's not ecology or geography or, for me, the history of humanity is not succumbing to geographical constraints. It's overcoming them. Look, when humans got to Greenland, eventually out of Africa, what did they do? Did they speciate? No. When ants got to Canada, there's 9,000 species of ants.
They got the other side of Hyde Park. When they got to the other side of Hyde Park.
They speciated, because it was cold and sort of rocky and whatever, but humans didn't do that. They invented igloos, and a taste for seal blubber, and I think that's the story about human society, but if you haven't read Guns, Germs, and Steel, read it. It's so inspiring and interesting. What else am I reading? Oh gosh, I read like lots of very specific things.
Anything lighter?
Anything lighter. I tell
it's hard to get heavier, so there's a lot of space there.
I just read Vargas Llosa's book, Harsh Times, which is his history of the coup in Guatemala against the Arbenz government. And then I went back and Trujillo,
I think you might have gotten the answer wrong. I think you might have gotten the answer wrong to go lighter.
Oh, okay. Well,
no, I'm completely joking with you. Well, I tell you what, the next question is, can you tell me a course that as a student changed your life?
Ooh. I think, the first economics class I took with Mikio Morishima when I was an undergraduate, Economics B, changed my life, completely changed my life, because it opened up this incredible, the first book we read was Weber's Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And, it turned out that's not what economics was about, but I thought it was about that. We read Schumpeter's Socialism, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. We read the general theory. We read Morishima's book about why had Japan succeeded. And, it was all about these big kind of comparative questions. And I guess I never quite recovered from having taken that class.
Well, we're certainly glad you haven't.
At an impressionable age,
Okay, so the last question is, if you had to make a pie with the ingredients that are in your house right now, what would you make for us?
I'm not very big on sweet things,
That's okay.
So I could make,
There's a variety of cultures that make a variety of things they call pie.
Yeah, I don't think we really eat pies actually, but you could in England, they make this thing called leek and potato pie. Or my mother used to make a vegetarian shepherd. I'm a vegetarian, you see. My mother used to make this vegetarian shepherd's pie. She called a vegetarian shepherd's pie.
It's kind of speaking to the Midwest too, right? So works out very well. Well, I tell you what, James, congratulations, and thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
It's been a lot of fun.